So I have a very distinguished panel today with me, with three of our alumni from Adyar Cancer Institute. We have Suman sir, we have Harsh sir, and then we have Dr. Piyush Bajpai sir as well. And apart from that, we have a lot of leading lights from Delhi as well. Dr. Dheeraj Gautam, an oncopathologist from Medanta, and Dr. Amit Verma, molecular oncologist, Max Hospital, Delhi, and Dr. Amanjeet Singh, leading GI surgeon at Medanta. So a warm welcome to all of you, and I'd also like to welcome Dr. Mani sir and also Dr. Sharma to be part of the panel discussion as well. So the first thing when I thought about when I was trying to plan for the panel discussion is no more of this right versus left, because we've always had enough and more about right versus left and sequencing treatment strategies as well. So let's see what else we can discuss about actually. So to kick things off, I'd like to bring in the oncopathologist here. So in any patient with a newly diagnosed metastatic CRC, what are the list of biomarkers? We've already heard Dr. Mani tell us about the NCCN and recommendations for the list of biomarkers. So what are the list of biomarkers that we actually routinely do in clinical practice? Anyway, probably Suman sir, you can start things off.
Hi Kripa, long time. Good evening, everyone. So usually the biomarkers we are usually doing are the KRAS, NRAS, BRAF. That are the usual biomarkers we do, and the MSI. So these are the four things we usually do in the CRCs, metastatic colorectals.
I think definitely, I think all of us agree with you. In clinical practice, that's what is being routinely done. But we've heard from Mani sir and also the recommendations of why you should do for a HER2 testing as well, because especially it's more relevant in somebody with a left-sided wild-type colorectal
Definitely.
cancer.
With the newer evidence, especially in the 2020 ASCO, I think HER2 testing will kick in. But right now, I think in the first-line metastatic patient which we get, I think HER2 will take a little time to set in the pen, come to our pen. I think maybe in the next 6 months, we'll be doing HER2 as a routine like we have been doing in stomach. But I think these are the four things which we are doing routinely, I'll say.
Absolutely agree with you, sir. Probably it might predict who would have a response to EGFR inhibitors, because if you have a wild-type patient and if they have a HER2 amplification, then probably EGFR inhibitors will not work on those patients. So for that, probably you might want to check on a HER2 status as well. Just quick thoughts from the oncopathologist here as to how would you want to do the testing, and also would you recommend doing the testing only from the primary site or from a metastatic site? And what about tumor heterogeneity as far as colorectal cancer is concerned? Dr. Dheeraj Gautam sir, if you're around.
Yeah. Okay, so MSI we usually do initially by ISC, and then if MSH1 is positive, and then we will go for the BRAF testing. If BRAF testing is negative, then we will go for the hypermethylation of BRAF. And then we will send it to the DNA methylation. That's the sequence for MSI. BRAF we can do by two methods, one from IST and one from NGS. Okay, so the interpretation of BRAF through the IST is little bit difficult, just because it is very light staining, and if you put in dab into that, then it may turn out to be false positive. So we usually avoid doing by IST. We usually do by NGS or by RT-PCR.
So I think the recommendations are to do a BRAF by RT-PCR, like you rightly said.
Yeah.
And so I just wanted to know your thoughts on whether you're okay with getting a testing done from the metastatic site, or do you insist on actually going in for the primary site? And what is the role of tumor heterogeneity? Do you have a lot of tumor heterogeneity?
Yes. We usually got a lot of heterogeneity. We usually prefer to do on primary site. If it is not available, then we can go for the metastatic side as well.
But what would be the incidence of heterogeneity, if I were to put it that way? Probably we can get in Dr. Amit Verma's thoughts as well.
Yeah.
Because when we talk about breast cancer, we say it's almost to the tune of around 20 to 25% as far as metastatic breast cancer is concerned. Is it the same numbers that we're talking about in colorectal cancer, or actually the numbers are very small? Because from whatever literature that I could find, it's only to the tune of around 3 to 4%. So is that is there any other difference of view about that? Dr. Amit sir, if he's around. Dr. Amit?
Yes, I'm here. Yes.
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah. So your thoughts on that, sir?
So can you come again with the question, please, again?
Sorry, yeah, I just wanted to know your thoughts on tumor heterogeneity as far as testing for all these molecular markers are concerned. Is it okay to get it tested on the metastatic site, or do you actually insist on going in for the primary site? And what would be the incidence of tumor heterogeneity between the primary and the metastatic site?
So the tumor heterogeneity is definitely a common phenomenon across all the cancers, and especially for the so if we see the BRAF or the KRAS, they are known to be driver mutations. So whatever heterogeneity we see, the driver or truncal mutation never changes, whether it is the primary site versus the metastatic site. Vis-a-vis, the patient may have some selection of the clones based on the previous treatment. So normally, if the patient had a primary KRAS mutant negative wild type, and non-treatment the patient develops new metastasis, they may have a KRAS mutant. So it is not heterogeneity, but more of a clonal evolution in terms of selection on the treatment pressure. That is one aspect. On the second aspect, which I want to emphasize, is the MLH1, MSH2, or the deficient MMR expression. So this is again, if it is based on the germline, you may not see any change in the heterogeneity. But if it is a somatic deficiency of mismatch repair, you may see a change in the heterogeneity. But primarily the MSI status never changes whether you do a primary testing or a metastatic testing. And if you want to talk about the third biomarker, that is the PIK3CA, and the fourth biomarker these days is the HER2, you may see a change in the analysis, change in the test outcome based on the tumor site of analysis. So depending upon what biomarkers you are talking about, you may see a difference in your testing actually.
So, and while you're at it, what would be the incidence of KRAS mutation in the right side, and is it different in the right side as compared to the left side? And you also said that probably it can be dynamic over time, meaning that it can change or evolve as well, probably due to clonal selection pressure as well. So what would be the incidence of a KRAS mutation? And because, as clinicians, I can tell you, a lot of us don't actually repeat a KRAS testing at the time of progression. We don't do that. So do you think we should actually do that every time a patient progresses, get a repeat biopsy and check for the RAS mutation again? Do you think we should do that? And what would be the incidence of that happening as well? Yeah, Amit sir, if you can take that.
Yeah, so the literature talks about this phenomenon actually. So patient who is a wild type KRAS on progression may develop KRAS mutant actually. So in terms of percentage, we do not have a lot of repeat biopsies, what we do in our clinical practice, so we don't have our own literature data. But to best of my knowledge, the change in the mutation status is in the range of 3 to 4%. So 3 to 4% patients may show the change in the KRAS status on progression, and that could be the explanation could be the selection under the treatment pressure. But that is my take on this topic actually. 3 to 4% is the expected change in the mutation status.
Sure. I think we'll agree with you because there's a very lack paucity of data as far as that is concerned, and it's only to the tune of around 3 to 4%, like you rightly said. And I think it has relevance as far as clinicians are concerned, because if you have a mutant patient who becomes wild type later on, then they become eligible for your EGFR inhibitors in the later lines of treatment as well. So moving on to the next part of the discussion, which are the molecular subtypes. We've heard Dr. Mani again talk to us about the consensus molecular subtypes. Are we there yet as far as using it in clinical practice, and what are the implications that we would have with the molecular subtypes? Dr. Dheeraj, if you can take that question, please.
Pardon, I didn't get you.
Yeah, I just wanted your thoughts on the molecular subtypes, the consensus molecular subtypes, and its implications in clinical practice. Are we ready for use in clinical practice with the consensus molecular subtypes? And what are the prognostic implications of these consensus molecular subtypes?
I think Dr. Amit would be the better person to answer this question because he's a molecular biome. Yeah.
Sure. I will get his thoughts. Back to you, Amit.
So I think the CMS classification, what you are showing in this.
Yes. Your voice is breaking. We can't hear you clearly. Dr. Amit, your voice is breaking. We can't hear you clearly.
Hello, Dr. Amit.
is not.
You can switch off your video and then you can
hear me
speak.
now? So is it better now?
Yes, perfect, sir.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So my take on this, So my take on the CMS classification is it is currently as of now an academic exercise, but in terms of the practical implications, we do not have much of insights based on the classification. Second of all, doing the CMS classification is based on the gene expression arrays actually, which is not commercially available. So this is again does not have an immediate clinical implication. The third, what I know, even if we have the access to this information, the CMS type 1 is the deficient mismatch or the MSI high kind of a status with the BRAF mutations. These patients may benefit with the immunotherapy. On the other hand, the CMS type 2, the canonical path, where the patients may benefit with the anti-EGFR and the anti-HER2. And the third, with the mesenchymal, which has the KRAS mutant, they are the one which definitely will show resistance to the EGFR-based treatment. And the fourth, with the third, the metabolic, and the fourth is the mesenchymal. The mesenchymal will be the one which will show resistance to the 5-FU-based treatment actually. So in toto, this is more of a prognostic classification as of now, with type 1 and type 4 carry the poor prognosis, and type 2 carries the best prognosis. In terms of predictive value of this classification, type 1 and type 4 may get benefit with the immunotherapy, and the type 2 will get the benefit with the anti-EGFR or anti-HER2 therapy.
Yeah, absolutely, in a nutshell. And I think it's fair enough to say that we're not yet ready for clinical practice with this yet. And it's a work in progress, and the TCG has come out with this. So it's interesting, food for thought, probably later somewhere down the line where we could look at gene expression profiling like you rightly said. So back to the medical oncologist here. I mean, like, what would be the key factors which should affect your selection of a first-line treatment in metastatic colorectal cancer? So if you could, Dr. Harsh sir or Piyush sir, can you take that? Out of all these factors, probably what would you consider to be the most important one?
Of course, thanks for asking this. So I think so all of the factors laid down over here are important. I mean, none in isolation, but of course, it is the performance status and the biomarker status, the first two ones. And of course, now biomarker is a sightedness is also a biomarker. So that becomes important. So all are important, but of course, if the performance status is fit enough for doublet regimen and the biomarker status for adding or considering the targeted therapy, that would be the choice. More importantly, that if it is a liver limited metastatic disease, then are we looking at increasing the survival with the subsequent surgery is also very important. So that is the key area where we should be including all our targeted therapies as well and choosing our biomarker wisely.
Sure, sir. And while you're at it, what percentage of patients in your clinical practice actually go on to receive second-line and third-line therapies, sir?
So usually now that we are doing maintenance therapies, we are probably catching the progression earlier. And therefore, the performance status really does not go really down. And that is one thing I would say, that it really does not go down before we can offer them the next line of therapies. So probably is it because of maintenance therapy or probably because of the biology that I have seen probably luckily. So I think so most of them do get second line and third line subsequently.
Okay. And what about Dr. Harsh sir? Are you there? What about in your practice as well? Do you agree with what Piyush sir is saying, or do you have any different thoughts on that? Dr. Harsh?
Yeah, I'm here. So
Hi,
I agree fully with Piyush sir. I think most of the patients, they go on to receive second line chemotherapy. I have many patients even on third line and beyond on palliative therapy also. After going through third or fourth line, they are still there. So I think it is the biology here of our patients and Indian patients, which actually drives them more, and we can actually pick and choose second line therapy, third line therapy, and make their life good. So I think we can say that most of the patients can.
So I think roughly, I know across the trials, when you look at it, about 50% go on to get second line therapy and about another 20% go on to receive third line therapy. This is just based on data and literature. That's what it says in the literature. So what would be your choice of third line therapy? I mean, like given that probably, let's say you used oxaliplatin, irinotecan, and then any of those targeted therapies in the first line, second line. So what would be your choice of third line treatment
I
in
think
India, in practice, in your practice?
This depends on the performance status at this point of time. If they are not fit, probably with a targeted agent, I would like to start on capecitabine or bevacizumab, irinotecan.
No, sir. Let's just say this patient has already been exposed to oxaliplatin, irinotecan, along with 5-FU based regimens as well, and has had a targeted therapy in the first and the second line as well. So what then are you left with? What are your third line options, and what would you
I'm currently using, if the patient is robust enough, we can tolerate, then regorafenib as the thing, or Leuporal. I'm currently using Leuporal also.
Tegafurira,
So these two things comes to mind, but the tolerance of regorafenib is really a question. So most of my patients, they do not tolerate regorafenib at all. So I think Leuporal, I've started using Leuporal nowadays, and let's see how it goes. Not much experience.
Kripa, I'll go back to what Harsh was trying to say.
Yes.
Most of our patients in practical scenario, in the constraint setting, go back to a lot of dose modified capecitabine.
Yeah.
Because most of them have drained their financial settings and all those things. So most of them go to a metronomic capecitabine or a very low dose capecitabine. So many of our times, I think Harsh will agree with me. Most of them sometimes go to a dose modified capecitabine also. What do you say, Harsh?
Yeah. My last option, when patient is not tolerating and is drained of money, then capecitabine is the option. 1 BD or 2, whatever you can take.
Something like a metronomic capecitabine, and it really works.
Yeah.
Agreed. Any form. So, like for example, even your Carcidox or doxofluridine, tegafurirasil, any of those drugs work as well. But
Regorafenib looks very good on the trials, but I find it very toxic. I think Piyush sir will be the best to answer that.
Yeah.
Thanks for saying that. But anyways, regorafenib, my experiences are also quite same. So we
so
also.
I think yes, sir. I mean, like, if I could probably add.
Yes, Piyush sir, please.
Yeah, we also look at the responses. I mean, if the response was really good with the 5-FU based regimens, and of course the performance status matters, whether single agent irinotecan was given upfront, fall free was given upfront, and there was a good PFS, probably reintroducing irinotecan. So that definitely is a juggling which goes. Also, at this point of time, there comes a consideration of checking HER2/neu most of the time, which has been missed upfront. So, that is also the time when you are looking at the third line.
In fact, I've now started using a low dose regorafenib. 80 mg of regorafenib works very well. 160 is quite bad.
Exactly, sir. In fact, that's what I was about to say as well. So we have a study called the REDOSE study, which has actually looked at a dosing strategy for regorafenib in colorectal cancer, where they started off with only 80 milligrams, and it was a weekly dose escalation strategy. We went up to 120 and 160. But in practice, even I've used only 80 milligrams. And given that now we have generic versions of regorafenib available, the cost has really come down as well. It's only around 19,000 per month. So, I mean, like that probably makes it an attractive option. But whatever you do, you're looking at only a median survival of around 6 months in the third line with any of these agents. So we've already heard this from Mani sir as well as Sharma about the FDA approval for immunotherapy in the first line setting as well, based on the Keynote 177 study, about a PFS doubling of the PFS from 8 to 16 months. So I think all the more reason for us to do an MSI upfront itself. And again, it's also approved in the third line setting as well, for patients who have progressed on 5-FU oxalate irinotecan, especially if you have an MSI high tumor. So that's where you currently look at placing immunotherapy. So moving on to re-challenge, I know we've already spoken about re-challenging as well. So how would you select a patient for re-challenging? What would be the time interval that you would be comfortable with before you select somebody for re-challenging, be it either your targeted therapy or your CM, your 5-FU based chemotherapy? Harsh sir, probably can you take that?
I think Piyush sir should take that. We have limited experience in that.
Senior most.
Senior most.
Okay, Piyush sir, back to you.
I haven't re-challenged cetuximab. I haven't re-challenged cetuximab. Probably Dr. Vaid sir, I would say.
Suman sir, I'm sure would have done that. Suman sir, you can share your experiences with us.
I have not, as I said, I have only re-challenged bevacizumab once or twice, but not cetuximab. But what I have been cetuximab, 2 patients I have re-challenged in my total thing. But in the re-challenge things, yes, the re-challenge of cetuximab, there were, I think the cricket trial was there. I think he has just shared the slide. Kripa is always ahead of us from the Adyar times. Piyush sir, you missed him in the institute. So he was always ahead of everyone. So this study was there, which was very interesting study. So personal, I think Kripa, you only share the study. You've shared it.
No, absolutely, sir. I mean, so I think there was no particular time frame. So I think that's what is really important. Yeah. So I mean, most of us probably, when you look at re-challenging capecitabine or oxaliplatin, we talk about at least 1 year, at least 6 months to 1 year before we reach somebody's had in the adjuvant setting and then develops metastatic disease. We're talking about at least a 1 year treatment-free interval. But whereas when it comes to re-challenging them in later lines of therapy, the time frame is absolutely unclear even from any of these studies. And all these studies basically are at best only phase 2. You don't have any phase 3 randomized control studies, nor is there any level 1 evidence to do that. And so those are the list of NCCN recommendations as well. In third line, again, you have regorafenib or TAS 102. So again, this is another thing that was alluded to in the previous discussion, the chemo-free regimen in metastatic CRC. So can I bring in Sharma here, because he actually spoke on this Beacon study. So Sharma, if you're there, so we always talk about talk about not using an EGFR inhibitor in somebody who's got a BRAF mutation, right? So why do you think, or what is the rationale behind using a EGFR inhibitor in somebody with a BRAF mutant CRC?
Sure. That's an excellent question. So why pertinent point which you are raised. So I just want to highlight here, those patients who are in the BRAF mutation patients, the monotherapy of BRAF will never work because there is a rapid, there is a feedback mechanism because anti-EGFR pathway is required for which have to be stopped. So, and one more thing I want to highlight here, the patients who are on BRAF inhibitor, if we won't stop MEK, if we won't give MEK inhibitor, there are high likelihood that this patient will develop squamous cell carcinoma, cutaneous squamous cell carcinoma, which will be inhibited if you have used BRAF inhibitor along with binimetinib, which is a MEK inhibitor, and cetuximab. That's the rationale why we should use all 3 of them. Then only you are going to get statistically significant and clinically meaningful benefit. As far as BRAF driver mutation is concerned, in metastatic melanoma or NSCLC, monotherapy of BRAF inhibitor is sufficient. But as far as colon cancer is concerned, monotherapy is not sufficient. You require MEK inhibitor, which is downstream pathway. Along with that, first cetuximab is the anti-EGFR.
I mean, I absolutely agree with you. In fact, that's the rationale for using a BRAF plus MEK inhibitor. But my point was, why would you need an EGFR inhibitor as well? You're using a BRAF plus MEK and an EGFR blocker as well. And that's something which we don't do routinely, right? So I mean, it was interesting because I had an opportunity to actually interact with Professor Axel Brothy, who's one of the lead investigators of the Beacon study, and he put forth this hypothesis saying that there can be a reactivation of this pathway through the EGFR signaling, and that's why you need to block the EGFR signaling because your alternate signaling pathways are controlled through that. That's why you use a BRAF plus MEK along with an EGFR inhibitor.
So what happens activates the CRAF pathway.
True. So the alternate signaling pathways, absolutely, sir. So
I have to present that study tomorrow in Apollo.
So absolutely. So like was pointed out by Suman sir, you have reactivation of the pathway through CRAS, and then again, it starts cascading again. So to prevent that from happening, you throw in an EGFR inhibitor to prevent the EGFR signaling. So that was the rationale. Very interesting as well. And as was already shown, has shown improvement in survival. So definitely an option in those BRAF mutant patients. But when you're talking about BRAF mutant patients, they're only about 8 to 10% in, especially in the right-sided colon cancer. So it's only applicable to those patients. Moving on to maintenance therapy, and in clinical practice, what do we do? Do we continue only the targeted therapy, or do we do targeted therapy along with chemotherapy? How is it like? Probably Harsh sir, your thoughts on that? Do you actually practice maintenance therapy, or you don't believe in that, or if so, how do you go about it? You'll have to unmute yourself. You're muted.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So I'm practicing maintenance, and most commonly we all give capecitabine as maintenance. So targeted, I am not given till now. But as you are showing, and the data says, you can give targeted, you can give combination, you can give capecitabine single agent, everything you can give as maintenance. So.
Okay. So you practice only capecitabine maintenance, okay? But what about Sumant sir and Piyush sir? What are your thoughts? What do you do in practice, sir?
Same here, maintenance therapy has caught up because of PFS at least, yes, overall survival benefit. But then we have to understand that most of the times that we are working outside a clinical trial scenario. So the patients who are actually following with us, eventually, subsequently, if they go on a drug holiday, would they return back at the time when they are progressing? So that is the important thing. But that probably is not a very reasonable answer to continue maintenance. But PFS is definitely a benefit which we discuss. And capecitabine and bevacizumab is 5-FU based therapy with bevacizumab is something which is considered. Cetuximab is not a choice for maintenance. If in case it's now being used is basically for conversion. So, yeah.
Okay. So Suman sir, what do you do in practice, sir?
Maintenance versus treatment holiday, it is a more of a discussion with the patient. So it's more on the compliance. Yes, in maintenance, capecitabine and bevacizumab both are options. Logistics, and I think both the things come in. Drug holiday is an option, but it all depends on the compliance of the patients and the patient choice. So it all becomes very tailored. But yes, our maintenance approach really is good because it gives a PFS benefit. OS, it rarely translates. Although 1 or 2 trials have shown OS benefit, I think Optimox has shown some OS benefit, but that also is a very, very jittery data.
True, sir. Absolutely. In fact, in the Optimox 1 and the Optimox 2, you actually talk about reintroducing the drugs at the time of progression as well. And that actually did not show any improvement in survival as well. So yeah, like you rightly pointed out, all these trials have shown a PFS benefit, and it needs to be a risk-benefit ratio, a discussion with the patient, and then at least put them on targeted therapy because that's supposed to be least beneficial. I mean, like with the least side effects as well. I'm sure Mani sir wouldn't agree with me because at the institute
Mani will kill us. And I think if we discuss this, if Mani tells this in the forum, I think we won't be able to go back to the institute.
So, yeah, absolutely, sir. So moving on to, I think we've kept our surgeon out for quite a long time. No time for us to bring the surgeon into the field. So we're talking about liver-limited metastatic disease, obviously, and that also becomes a surgeon's ballgame. So we know about 30 to 70% will go on to develop liver metastasis. And these are the patients who actually, if they present with resectable liver metastasis, who want to have a good survival as well. So the surgeon, Dr. Amanjeet sir, sorry for having kept you out of the discussion for such a long time.
No. I was enjoying the discussion. That was all
your domain. So can you tell us something about the presentation of liver-limited disease? What percentage are actually presenting with resectable liver-limited metastasis? And what are your, in your practice, sir, and what would you see?
Can you hear me? Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, sir. We can hear you. Please
Okay. So first of all, whenever I attend a medical oncology meeting, I'm happy that I'm not a medical oncologist because there are very little controversies in surgery. There are not so many options, not so many controversies.
We'll get to the controversies now, sir.
Yes. No. Even then, there are not that first line, second line surgery or third line surgery. So it's only one surgery, remove the colon and the lymph nodes. So coming to the question, I think as you rightly told, the incidence of resectable disease is around 15 to 20% only. So basically there are 4 scenarios. One is the resectable primary with the resectable liver metastasis. So in those cases, I think majority of us will agree that since it looks like a systemic disease, So it's better to give chemotherapy, maybe 3 or 4 cycles of chemotherapy, then reassessment, and then plan for surgery. So the other scenario is if you are having a symptomatic primary and along with the unresectable metastasis. So in those cases, probably they will primarily need surgery. Surgery, especially if it is not a bleeding. For bleeding, I think there is evidence that if you give chemotherapy, these patients might benefit and bleeding might decrease. But for obstruction, perforation, these patients are going to need surgery. Third scenario is if the primary is bulky, along with the primary is asymptomatic and there is a bulky liver disease. So these patients, if you give chemotherapy, they are the candidate for chemotherapy first, and there is a response to chemotherapy. They are probably the candidates where we'll be going a reverse approach, which is basically the liver first, because the main bulk of the disease is in the liver and not in the colon. So dealing with the liver first and then followed by the primary. It's especially true if the tumor is a rectal cancer, because majority of rectal cancer, they will need radiation along with the chemotherapy. So you cannot give upfront radiation because these patients then will be losing that time, 1.5 months or so. So these patients, you will give 4 cycles of neoadjuvant followed by reassessment, surgery of the liver, then complete your radiation, and then plan for the surgery for the primary. So this is basically the reverse liver first approach. So this is a different scenario. And as a general principle, as a surgeon, we normally do the surgery as a stage surgery. We normally avoid doing a major liver section along with the primary. So if it is just a metastectomy, we'll be doing. But overall, we have seen that patients in which we have done heroic surgeries, doing a major hepatectomy along with, even if technically we can do it, majority of they will end up with infections, thus delaying the chemotherapy further. So we'll be doing it like a stage surgery.
Sure, absolutely agree with you. In fact, I think this is the first time I'm hearing a surgeon say that even if you have resectable disease, you don't lead in with chemotherapy, because surgeons usually jump the gun. They say, yeah, we'll go ahead and operate on this, especially if it's a resectable primary with liver-limited metastatic disease, which is also resectable. We have had surgeons even tell them that they would, wouldn't even want to do a stage metastectomy. They would want to go in and do both at the same sitting, not even consider either the liver first or the primary first approach. So it's really heartening to hear that from you, sir.
Yes.
So I think probably if I were to put it in a nutshell, I would say for resectable disease, yes, definitely contemplate surgery, especially if they're symptomatic for the primary. For borderline resectable and unresectable cases, conversion chemotherapy is the way to go. And so how do you look at defining resectability, sir? I think that's a key question that needs to be addressed. So how do you look at, especially when it comes to the liver, how do you look at defining resectability?
So as a general principle, yes, if you can leave around 3 segments of the liver behind, 3 contiguous segments with a good inflow and outflow. So the rest of the liver you can just get away with. So in a normal liver, we look for around 25 to 30% of the normal liver. But if it is a post chemotherapy, we'll go for around, to be on the safer side, 35 to 40%. Although there is evidence you can go up to 30%. So that is our general principle. So if that much liver you can easily remove.
Okay, sir. So we always talk about this residue, but how do you find out about the functional liver residue, sir? Because we only talk about the percentage of liver tissue that's left behind, but how do you assess the functional liver residue? Do you do something like an ICG, indocyanine green test? How do you do that?
Speaking, there are, but we do not use it routinely.
We don't.
So if there are 3 contiguous segments and there is an inflow and outflow result, so majority of time you'll be able to judge it clinically only. So we do not do it ICG clearance routinely. So if you're anyway doubtful, it's better not to do and go for some these techniques like portal vein ambulation or others.
Sure, absolutely agree with you on that. And like you rightly pointed out, again, we have other forms of local therapy as well, like the transarterial chemoembolization, RFA, or SBRT as well. We don't have a radiation oncologist, so I'll just quickly run through this. I think the only issue for with radiotherapy is that you can have an incidence of radiation-induced liver disease as well. That's to the tune of less than 5%, where you can have anectric ascites and elevation of liver enzymes as well. Can happen about from 2 weeks up to 4 months after RT and can rarely result in liver failure and death as well. So if you're looking at selecting a patient for SBRT, probably you'll have to remember the rule of 3, where you have 3 lesions less than 3 centimeters and less than 1 centimeter, from the organ at risk, and they need to be in a child Pug A, and the liver volume should be at least more than 1000 cc. So I think this is where I need to bring in my med-onc colleagues as well. So as far as liver-limited resectable disease is concerned, do you believe that you need to lead in with chemotherapy or go ahead and do straight surgery? Piyush, sir, your thoughts on that? Would you actually lead in with chemotherapy or say, okay, fine, it's resectable, let the surgeon go ahead and do
So if
surgery?
it's a resectable, the first scenario, I think so the surgeon would take a call definitely after a MDT. And of course, the second scenario, it is the conversion therapy that the second photograph, the picture.
Yeah. Yes.
I think so that would be the time of conversion therapy, depending on the biomarker and the sidedness and the performance status. BRAF means are we going for triplet? So that would be the choices of therapy.
But given that even though liver-limited metastatic disease, even if it's resectable, it's a systemic disease, patient has already got stage 4 disease, would you like to give chemotherapy to assess the biology of the disease, to look for the chemoresponsiveness, and to absolutely select out patients who can actually benefit more? Would you like to do that, sir, or would you just say, it's all right, let's go ahead with primary surgery? The pros and cons.
Well, there is always a chance of progression if it's absolutely a resectable disease and it's not a borderline scenario. And if it's a resectable disease, there is always a chance whatever chemotherapy or side effects of chemotherapy or causing a blue liver syndrome or steatosis, there are always chances that you might end up with some situation where you could have.
I think you hit the nail on the head. I think the key disadvantage could be if you have unresectable tumor progression. But then, I mean, like people always have a counter argument to saying that probably if that is the case, and then again they have a very bad biology, and probably they would not have benefited from surgery even in the first place. But that there are two sides to the coin, and there are always two ways of looking at it. Yes. Absolutely.
I think decision depends on who gets the patient first. But as a protocol, I think majority of institution now has a MDT. So
can I make a comment here? Can I make a comment here?
Yes, sir, please.
There have been two trials. There is a data from Memorial Sloan Kettering and a German trial. Both have looked at it. So the Memorial Sloan Kettering was a very simple design: resectable, resect, and follow. And the other arm was to give chemotherapy, resect, and complete the rest of the chemotherapy. I think the resection arm and the preoperative chemotherapy arm did equally well. So if it is a resectable disease, it should be resected. And who knows, the tolerance to chemotherapy, the other events may make the patient unresectable over a period of time. And
that is basically,
as far as the biology of the disease is concerned, if somebody is presenting in a short period of time from the previous therapy, I think the biology matters. But if somebody presents at 18 months, 24 months from the previous therapy, the biology is well stated. So therefore, that's the situation where the surgeon will be in the driver's seat more than the medical oncologist.
Absolutely, sir. Great points there. Absolutely. And like you rightly pointed out, obviously, if you have somebody with a liver-limited resectable disease, and if you believe that the primary is operable and also the liver is also resectable, I think you should definitely contemplate surgery or have an MDT and sit together with the surgeon, assess the functional liver residual volume as well, and then go ahead and offer them surgery. Because like you rightly pointed out, the other adverse effects of giving chemotherapy as well, the so-called blue liver, when the surgeon operates on it, the blue liver, which is because of oxaliplatin-induced sinusoidal obstruction syndrome or even irinotecan-induced steatohepatitis. There's clear data to show that presence of these actually portends a poor prognosis as well. So I think that really needs to be kept in mind as well. And again, just a question to probably Harsh sir or Sumant sir, if you're there. If you have somebody with probably a borderline resectable liver metastasis, what would be the role of targeted therapy or the addition of targeted therapy in that setting, especially with somebody with resectable disease? Has clearly shown that there's absolutely no benefit of adding targeted therapy in that setting. So I think that's definitely not indicated. And again, bevacizumab, the issue is, I think we all know about how it can cause delayed wound healing and also cause perforation and fistulas. So we'll have to stop it at least 4 to 6 weeks prior to surgery. And that's one of the reasons as to why when it comes to conversion chemotherapy, EGFR inhibitors are always considered to be ahead of VEGF if you have a RAS, RAF wild type patient. So moving on to the role of conversion chemotherapy, what would be your choice of conversion chemotherapy, doublet, triplet, and what would be your choice of targeted therapy as well? Sumant sir or Harsh sir, if you're there, probably you can take this.
I think I'll be inclined towards the FOLFIRINOX or triplet because of the good response rates. And I'm a little bit jittery nowadays because two of my patients have developed this VOD after having this oxaliplatin. So still FOLFIRINOX is the answer for me.
So you would use a triplet, and your choice of targeted therapy would be?
Triplet, I think I will not go for BEV.
Okay. Unless and until you have a RAS/RAF mutant patient, then in that case, you would go with bevacizumab. But if you have a wild type patient, would you still contemplate?
I'll go for.
If you have a mutant patient, what would you contemplate? You would just give a triplet and not even give any targeted therapy, or would you contemplate bevacizumab?
No, I do not use in this scenario. I use FOLFOXIRI.
Oh, okay. And Piyush sir, your thoughts on that? If you have a mutant, maybe a RAS mutant or a RAF mutant patient, and if you're trying conversion chemotherapy, would you go in only with the triplet or only chemotherapy, or would you add targeted therapy also?
So for right colon and a BRAF mutant, FOLFIRINOX plus minus the bevacizumab. Bevacizumab would be tapered off prior to surgery. For a left-sided and wild type, of course, cetuximab is definitely in with the FOLFOX or a FOLFIRI. FOLFOX most of the times. With the KRAS mutant present, if the individual is young, can consider with the wild type, I would not use a triplet. I would go for doublet only for the left side. If there is a KRAS mutation, then if the patient is young, good performance status, can consider FOLFIRINOX and bevacizumab, with bevacizumab being tapered off earlier.
Sure. I think as far as conversion chemotherapy is concerned, triplets definitely score over doublets because the response rates seem to be higher with a triplet as opposed to a doublet, number one. And number two, obviously the addition of a targeted therapy also adds to your response rates to the tune of 10 to 15%. And your choice of targeted therapy could again be based on the mutational status. If you have a wild type tumor, obviously you would go with EGFR inhibitor because they have slightly better response rates because your early tumor shrinkage is probably better with your EGFR inhibitors as opposed to your VEGF inhibitors. And they're also slightly safer than your VEGF inhibitors when it comes to, especially comes to conversion chemotherapy, because these are patients who are likely to undergo surgery as well. So absolutely, Piyush sir, as you rightly pointed out, I think that would be the way to go. And this is what the ESMO risk stratification is. Obviously, if you have somebody with resectable disease, you would go ahead with surgery. And whether the liver first approach or the primary first approach is still up for debate, because it depends on how symptomatic the patient is. Whether the patient is symptomatic for the primary, then you would probably look at addressing the primary. And again, the other thing probably in this potentially resectable group is that sometimes when you lead in with chemo plus targeted therapy, you have these liver lesions that can completely disappear as well. So then, it becomes a nightmare for the surgeon to actually operate on. And you'll have to rely on intra-op ultrasounds and still, you really have to do all those things. So again, borderline resectable and not resectable, unresectable, you will definitely lead in with conversion chemotherapy and then look at addressing them with surgery later on. So I think we have pros and cons for every modality of treatment that are available to us now. Surgery, definitely yes. As far as if you can define resectability, yes, definitely surgery remains the best option. And again, the problem with surgery probably is that, when it comes to metastectomy, like as was already pointed out by Dr. Amanjeet as well, a staged metastectomy or whether doing it in the same setting is something that needs to be contemplated as well. And as far as chemotherapy, yeah, we could have systemic or even TACE or HACE as well. But we must remember that whatever it is, the biology, as Dr. Ashok Ved sir also put it, if somebody who's already progressed from the adjuvant and now become metastatic disease with a long treatment-free interval, yeah, you already know about the biology of the disease. But apart from that, if it's a de novo metastatic disease, then you're really not sure about the biology of the disease as well. So again, the other forms of local therapy like RFA and SBRT can be contemplated as well. And with that, probably I'll conclude and thank all the panelists for giving me the wonderful insight.